It was one of those late mornings when everything seemed off. The sun was hiding behind thick clouds, and the streets were slick from the recent rain. I had just finished a long night of hearings and was eager to head home for a quiet afternoon when I was stopped at a red light, waiting to turn left onto Elm Street. I hadn't noticed the patrol car following me until it flashed its lights and sirens, signaling for me to pull over. I glanced at the rearview mirror and could see the officer's figure, his body rigid, almost as if he were preparing for something. My first instinct was to pull over as quickly as possible, though a nagging thought flickered in my mind. It wasn't the first time I had been pulled over for a minor infraction, but today felt different. Maybe it was the officer's sudden aggression, or perhaps it was the way his hand hovered near his weapon. I knew I needed to keep my cool. I rolled down the window as the officer approached, his steps heavy and deliberate. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle," he commanded, his voice sharp and filled with authority. Confused, I did as instructed, leaving my car running with the door ajar. "Officer, is there a problem?" I asked, trying to stay calm and composed. "You're driving a stolen vehicle," he said without any hesitation, his tone accusatory. His eyes narrowed as if he had already made up his mind. The words hit me like a punch. Stolen? How could he possibly think that? I didn't say anything at first, trying to process what he was implying. "This car? Are you serious?" I finally managed to say, my voice steady but laced with disbelief. He didn't respond immediately, just looked at me with a firm, unyielding stare. His hand still hovered over his radio as if waiting for backup. The tension in the air was palpable, as though the smallest misstep on my part could escalate things further. But before I could ask anything more, he stepped back and said, "I need to check the registration." I nodded, and as I reached for my ID, I saw something in the officer's eyes shift, just a flicker of hesitation. But it wasn't enough to make him back down. "Stay put," he ordered. I took a deep breath. Something told me this wasn't going to be a quick stop. The officer walked to his patrol car, leaving me standing there, my hand still gripping my ID, unsure of what would happen next. I glanced back at my car, a reliable silver sedan, just a few years old. I had no idea where this was going, but the tension was thick, and the heavy silence was only broken by the distant hum of traffic. I tried to remind myself to stay calm, even though my pulse was racing. What was going on? Why was I being treated like this? A few minutes passed before the officer returned, his face a little less composed than before. He was holding a piece of paper in his hand, a frown deepening on his face. "I don't understand," he muttered, glancing at the paper, then back at me. "This vehicle's registration doesn't match up with the make and model I've got listed here." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This was insane. "That's impossible," I said, my voice steady but firm. "I've had this car for over a year. I've paid off the loan, and everything is legitimate. There must be some mistake." The officer glanced at me, unsure whether to press further. His eyes flicked down to my hands, where I was still holding my ID, and then to my face, now set in a calm but serious expression. He started, but then his radio crackled with a sudden command, cutting him off. "Unit 4 to 7, come in. We've got a report here on a black sedan matching the description. It's registered under a judge's name," the dispatcher said over the radio. The officer's eyes widened. My heart sank. I saw the realization hit him all at once, the weight of his mistake crashing down. I was no longer just a civilian, no, I was someone important. His body language shifted, his shoulders slumped ever so slightly, and his voice faltered. "Wait a minute," he muttered to himself, running a hand through his hair. "What? Are you Judge Harper?" I couldn't help but raise an eyebrow at him. "That's me," I replied, keeping my voice even. "And now you know why I'm so calm. I don't need to explain why you were mistaken. But I'll give you the benefit of the doubt that you were just doing your job." The officer stood there, frozen for a moment, a wave of embarrassment washing over his face. He clearly didn't know how to respond. He was trying to reconcile what he thought he knew with the reality of who I was. I watched his face for a moment longer, waiting for him to find his words, but instead, he glanced away, his eyes scanning the pavement. Finally, he spoke. I'm so sorry, ma'am. This won't go any further. I'll clear this up right away. I gave him a slow nod, my gaze unblinking, before I stepped back toward my car. There was still a coldness in the air, but it was starting to feel like the moment was passing. He fumbled with his radio again, no longer aggressive, his tone now laced with uncertainty. Unit 4 to 7, disregard the stop. Everything's clear. I waited, my fingers brushing against the handle of my car door, ready to drive away and put this madness behind me. The officer stood there in silence, still holding the radio in one hand, his other hand at his side. The tension that had once been so thick now felt like it was evaporating, but the damage was done. His face was a mixture of embarrassment and regret, and I couldn't help but feel a little satisfaction knowing he was finally realizing the full weight of his mistake. But I wasn't going to let this go without addressing it. You know, I said, my voice calm but with an edge of authority, it's a good thing you caught that radio call. Otherwise, who knows how long this would have gone on. The officer's gaze flickered back to me. Yes, ma'am. I know. I don't know what to say. I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions like that. Yeah, I replied. You should have verified everything before making an accusation like that. I took a step toward him, my posture stiff but controlled. You see, I spend my days working in the very system that's meant to uphold justice. I make decisions that affect people's lives. But I've never been treated this way. Never. I don't care what your personal beliefs are. You have to treat everyone with respect. Everyone. The officer looked down at the pavement, a visible shame crossing his face. I understand. I made a huge mistake, and I'll make sure it never happens again. For a moment, I didn't respond. I let the weight of my words sink in, watching him try to make sense of his actions. I didn't need to give him an immediate forgiveness, but I did need to see that he understood the gravity of what had just occurred. Finally, after a long pause, I exhaled and turned toward my car. I'm going to let you off easy today. But don't ever forget what it feels like to be wrongly accused. I opened the door to my car, my hand pausing for a second as I looked back at him one last time. Maybe next time you'll think before you make an assumption about someone based on, I don't know, the color of their car, or their skin. The officer didn't answer right away. His head hung low, and I could tell he was deeply regretting his actions. I got into my car, shut the door, and started the engine. The officer was still standing there, watching me drive away. I didn't look back. But just as I reached the end of the street, I couldn't help but notice his figure in the rearview mirror. He was still standing by his patrol car, his shoulders slumped. And for the first time in our brief encounter, I saw the weight of his failure clearly written on his face. I drove off, but the feeling that lingered wasn't one of anger or frustration, it was something different, a mixture of disbelief and a strange kind of sorrow. It wasn't just about him. It was about what he represented. And in some strange way, I knew this wasn't the last time I'd have to deal with something like this. The drive home felt longer than it should have. As I navigated through the familiar streets, the quiet hum of the engine was the only sound in the car. My mind was racing, replaying the events of the past hour over and over. It wasn't the first time I had been questioned, but there was something uniquely frustrating about this one. Maybe it was because of my position, my role in the justice system, and how quickly someone could decide to strip that away. I pulled into my driveway, the cool air brushing against my face as I shut off the engine. I sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the house ahead. The house I had worked so hard to build, the life I had earned. But something had shifted in me. The usual sense of control that came with my career was rattled. Today, I had been reminded in a very harsh way that, no matter how much power or authority I had in the courtroom, out in the world, I was still just another target. A person whose identity could be questioned with no more than a fleeting glance. I couldn't ignore the way that officer had looked at me. There was no real apology in his words, just a desperate attempt to undo what he had done. But it wasn't about the apology anymore. It was about the larger picture. The assumption. The quickness with which he judged me. How easily he'd mistaken my identity and made me feel less than. I stepped out of the car and walked up to the door, but as I reached for the handle, something held me back. I turned back around and looked down the street, toward the road where the officer had pulled me over. It struck me how many people in this town had probably faced the same treatment. Not necessarily in my exact situation, but in the same way, being unjustly suspected, wrongly accused, and then left to fight for their dignity. It wasn't just a moment for me. It was a reflection of a larger system, of a culture that still made snap judgments and assumed things based on nothing more than appearances. I knew this wasn't the end of it. The officer would go back to his duties, and life would continue, but for me, something had changed. I had seen firsthand how fragile justice could be. How it could be questioned on a whim, twisted by someone's bias, even unintentionally. And I wasn't sure how to feel about that. Angry? Disappointed? Or was it just the stark realization that we were all only as safe as the system that protected us? As I opened the door to my house and stepped inside, the weight of it all settled onto my shoulders. But I couldn't let it break me. I couldn't let it stop me from doing my job. I had to push through the frustration. To remember why I fought for justice, why I upheld the law. Even if the law sometimes failed those who needed it most. I walked inside and paused, taking a deep breath. I could feel the presence of my colleagues, of the people who respected me, the people I had helped. They were my constant. My purpose. And if anything, today had only reaffirmed my commitment to them, and to making sure that no one else ever had to face what I had. But I couldn't ignore the fact that there were still so many fights to be fought. And this was just one of them. The days that followed were strangely quiet. I didn't hear from the officer again, nor did I expect to. He had done what he could to rectify his mistake, and I had done what I could to make sure he understood the severity of it. But as much as I wanted to forget about the encounter, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unresolved, something deeper that needed to be addressed. I returned to work a few days later, slipping back into the rhythm of courtrooms, legal papers, and the cases I'd been dealing with for years. The people I worked with were respectful, as they always had been, but there was a strange undercurrent to everything. I couldn't shake the thought of the officer's face, the guilt, the embarrassment. The way his eyes had briefly met mine, full of realization and regret. It wasn't just about him. It was about the system as a whole, the flaws within it, the biases that, whether intentional or not, seeped into the interactions between the people and those meant to protect them. I couldn't forget that day. One morning, just as I was preparing for a case, I received a call from my assistant. "Judge Harper, you've been invited to speak at a conference next week. It's about improving relations between the community and law enforcement." I paused, a little surprised. "Who's hosting it?" "The city's public safety office," she replied. "They want your perspective on how to address situations like the one you experienced, and to help bridge the gap between police officers and the people they're supposed to serve." I was silent for a moment. It was a strange invitation, considering what had happened just days ago, but there was an odd feeling that rose in me, one that was both anger and opportunity. I had the chance to be heard, to speak about the bigger issue, the system's flaws, and maybe, just maybe, help others understand what it felt like to be judged on something as shallow as appearance or suspicion. "I'll accept," I finally said. That night, as I prepared for the speech, I reflected on everything that had happened. I wasn't just a judge in that moment anymore. I wasn't just someone who had been wrongly accused. I was an advocate. A voice for everyone who had ever been mistaken, misjudged, or misrepresented by a system that wasn't perfect. I wasn't going to let the officer's mistake, or any of the other injustices I had witnessed over the years, define me. I would use my experience to educate, to push for change. To make sure this didn't happen again. I had no idea what the conference would bring, or how it would go, but one thing was clear, I was no longer just a passive observer in the system. I was a part of it, and I was determined to make it better. The day of the conference arrived quicker than I expected. I stood before the large crowd in the conference hall, the faces of law enforcement officers, city officials, and community leaders staring back at me. My speech had been carefully crafted, but I felt a knot in my stomach as I walked to the podium. There were so many expectations placed on this moment, not just for me, but for everyone in that room. I could feel the weight of the room's anticipation. They expected answers, solutions, something that could bridge the growing divide between law enforcement and the communities they served. But I knew the truth, the solution wasn't simple. It couldn't be summed up in a few sound bites. I cleared my throat and began. Good morning, I started, my voice firm yet steady. I'm here today not as a judge, but as a woman who has experienced firsthand what happens when assumptions are made. When decisions are rushed without understanding the truth. When people are judged based on the color of their skin, their background, or their status. The room was silent. I could sense the tension, a mix of guilt and curiosity. Some of the officers in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but I wasn't going to pull back. Not now. Not after what I had lived through. I was stopped by a police officer a few days ago, I continued, looking around the room to make eye contact with as many people as I could. He accused me of driving a stolen car, something that was not only false but entirely baseless. In that moment, it wasn't just my car that was questioned, it was me. My identity. My integrity. And it wasn't the first time something like this has happened. It won't be the last. I paused, allowing the weight of my words to settle in. I could see heads nodding in the crowd, some with understanding, others more defensive. But, I continued, this isn't about one officer or one incident. This is about a culture of assumptions. A culture where, too often, people in positions of power make judgments before they have the full picture. It's about law enforcement, about our justice system, and about all of us. Who are we really serving? I let those words sink in, and for a moment, I felt the energy of the room shift. The defensiveness was still there, but I could feel a softening, a willingness to hear me out. Officers should never have to make decisions based on instinct or bias. And the public shouldn't have to live with the fear of being wrongfully accused, of having their identity stripped away in an instant because of a snap judgment. This is a failure of the system, and it's a failure of all of us who are part of it. There was a long silence in the room after that, and for a moment, I thought I had gone too far. But then, a few officers in the crowd began to nod slowly, their expressions more thoughtful than before. They were hearing me, finally. Look, I said, leaning forward slightly, I understand that not every officer is like the one I encountered. I understand that this is not easy. But we need to be better. We need to stop assuming things about people based on what we see or what we think we know. If we are to truly serve justice, we must start with understanding that everyone has a story, a life, a history that cannot be summed up in a moment of error. I could see the shift now, more officers were nodding, more of the community leaders were looking at each other, exchanging glances. The realization had begun to settle in. This isn't just a one-time conversation, I added, my voice more resolute now. This needs to be a movement. A call for real change. It's not enough to apologize after the fact. It's not enough to let one mistake go unnoticed. We need to address the culture within law enforcement that allows these assumptions to take root. By the end of the speech, I could feel the air in the room change completely. The defensive energy had faded, replaced by something else, a recognition that change was not only possible, but necessary. I finished my speech with a call to action, urging everyone in the room to take responsibility, not just for their actions, but for the culture they were part of. It was a long road ahead, but the first step had been taken. We had acknowledged the problem. Now it was time to find the solution. The applause that followed was slower than I expected, but it was genuine. And that was all I needed. In the days that followed, something unexpected happened. The feedback I received from the conference wasn't just positive, it was transformative. Officers, community leaders, and even those who had initially resisted the idea of change reached out to me. They thanked me for speaking out, for forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths. Some admitted their own biases, while others acknowledged the systemic issues they had once ignored. It felt as if the conversation had shifted, even if only slightly. But that's all it ever took, one shift, one ripple that spread to the next. A few days later, I received an email from the city's public safety office. They had been so moved by my speech that they wanted to implement a new initiative aimed at training officers in better communication and understanding of cultural biases. It wasn't a full solution, not by any means, but it was a step in the right direction. The city was willing to take responsibility for addressing the issues I had raised. They also invited me to be part of an advisory board that would help shape the training program. It wasn't just about pushing for changes within law enforcement, it was about reshaping the relationship between the police and the community, rebuilding trust where it had been broken. I couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. This wasn't something I had expected when I set foot on that stage. But as the days passed, I realized how crucial it was to keep pushing, to keep talking. The system didn't change overnight, but it didn't need to. What mattered was that people were beginning to listen. In my own life, things had also begun to settle. The memory of that officer's mistake no longer weighed on me as heavily, though I could still recall the look in his eyes when he realized who I was. I wondered if he ever thought about that moment, if he realized that he wasn't just apologizing to me, but to everyone who had ever been misjudged. I hoped he had learned something from it. As for me, the experience had left a mark, but it had also fueled a fire. I knew there would be more challenges ahead, more situations where the system failed, more moments where assumptions would be made. But I was ready. I had found my voice in a way I hadn't known was possible before. It wasn't just about that one officer or that one mistake. It was about the larger picture, the ways in which we all needed to change. I wasn't going to let the system define me. I was going to help redefine the system. The work was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, I felt hope. A month passed, and I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened since that day I was pulled over. I had become an unlikely catalyst for change, not because of anything extraordinary I had done, but because I had simply stood up in a moment where others might have remained silent. The ripple effect of my words and actions had spread far beyond that conference room, and I was beginning to see real change take shape, even in places I hadn't expected. One afternoon, as I sat in my office reviewing legal documents, my assistant knocked on the door and entered, holding a letter in her hand. It was from a group of law enforcement officers in a neighboring city, expressing their interest in implementing a similar training program. They had heard about the initiative we were rolling out and wanted to bring me in to help. I was floored. I had been so focused on my local community that I hadn't realized the reach of my message. It seemed my words had sparked a wave that others were now eager to ride. Over the next few weeks, I worked closely with the Public Safety Office to refine the program. It wasn't perfect, and there was still much work to be done, but we were on the right track. Officers who had been resistant to the idea of self-reflection were now taking part in open discussions about their biases, their assumptions, and how they could serve their communities better. I spoke to a few of them, hearing their stories of how they had changed their perspectives, how they now understood the importance of truly seeing the people they interacted with, not just through the lens of their badge, but through their humanity. But it wasn't just about law enforcement. The ripple effect was affecting the community as well. I received messages from people, some of whom had been in similar situations as I had, others who had never thought about the realities of bias, expressing their gratitude. One letter, in particular, stood out. It was from a young black man who had been wrongly detained by the police for a crime he didn't commit. After reading about my experience, he decided to speak out, to demand answers for the injustices he had faced. His courage inspired others to come forward, and soon, there was a community-wide discussion on racial profiling and the importance of reform. I was invited to speak at more conferences, more community forums, and even in classrooms where students were learning about justice, equality, and the power of their voices. I began to realize that I wasn't just part of a legal system, I was part of a much larger movement, one that transcended the walls of courtrooms and the constraints of legal jargon. This was about real people, real lives, and the possibility of making things right, one conversation at a time. Still, not everyone agreed with the changes I was advocating for. There were critics, especially from within the ranks of law enforcement, who felt that the focus on bias and systemic issues was undermining the work they did. They saw the training initiatives as a challenge to their authority rather than an opportunity for growth. But that, too, was part of the process. Change always comes with resistance. And for every critic, there were two more people who stood with me, who were willing to be uncomfortable for the sake of progress. As I looked back on the officer who had made that initial mistake, I couldn't help but wonder where he was now. Had he stayed in law enforcement? Had he taken the lessons of that day to heart, or had he let them fade with time? I hoped he remembered our conversation, even if only for a moment. I hoped he remembered that day when he had looked at me, not as a judge, but as a human being, and realized that his assumptions were wrong. In the end, it wasn't about him, or even about me. It was about the opportunity we all had to make the world a little better, to bring more understanding, and to create a justice system that worked for everyone. I wasn't going to stop, not until I knew we had done everything we could to right the wrongs and make sure that no one else had to go through what I had. And the ripple? It was still spreading. Months passed, and what had started as a single incident, a moment of injustice and misjudgment, had become something much larger. The changes weren't just in the law enforcement policies or training programs. They were in the way people began to see each other. The conversations, the confrontations, and the introspection had led to real shifts in attitude. Not everything was perfect, not everything was resolved, but it was a start. One afternoon, I sat in my office, reviewing some cases, when my assistant brought in a stack of letters. The top envelope was embossed with an official seal. As I opened it, I saw that it was an invitation to a ceremony recognizing the city's progress on police reform and community trust. They wanted me to speak. I had heard murmurs about how our work was being recognized, but this felt different. It wasn't just about me anymore, it was about the collective effort of everyone who had been a part of this journey. The officers who had joined the training, the community leaders who had rallied for change, and the people who had spoken up after my speech, it was their voices that had created the momentum. I was merely the spark. On the day of the ceremony, I found myself standing in front of a full crowd, both law enforcement officers and members of the community who had come together to acknowledge the progress we had made. I looked out at the audience, and for a brief moment, I felt the weight of everything that had come before me. This moment was not just for me, it was for every person who had been wrongly judged, who had faced systemic bias, and who had fought for change. I stepped up to the podium, and the room fell silent. When I was stopped that day by that officer, I began, my voice steady, I didn't know that it would lead me here. I didn't know that I would be standing before you, not just as a judge, but as a part of a much larger conversation, a conversation about accountability, about justice, and about how we treat one another. The crowd was still, hanging on to every word. I didn't seek this attention, I continued. But sometimes, in life, you don't get to choose the moments that define you. What you do get to choose is how you respond. And I chose to speak out, to bring attention to the biases that still exist in the system I serve. And it was only because of all of you, the officers who chose to take a hard look at themselves, the community members who spoke out, the families who pushed for justice, that we are seeing real change. I paused, letting the words sink in. I don't stand here today as someone who has all the answers. But I stand here as someone who believes that the work we've done together can make a real difference. Not just for today, but for future generations. We are setting the example for what it means to do justice, not just in the courtroom, but in the streets, in our communities, and in our hearts. The room erupted in applause, but I knew it wasn't just for me. It was for the collective effort, the hard work, and the dedication that had gone into changing the system, brick by brick. As I left the ceremony that evening, I felt a strange sense of peace. The work wasn't finished, of course. There would be more battles to fight, more injustices to correct. But I had come to understand that justice wasn't just a one-time act. It was a process, a journey, and one that required constant vigilance, courage, and compassion. I drove home that night, the lights of the city fading in the rearview mirror, but I didn't feel the weight of the world on my shoulders anymore. I felt empowered. I had done what I could, and now it was up to others to carry the torch forward. And so, the ripple continued.